In my presentation today, I chose to concentrate on potent places. I will explain in a few minutes what are potent places in Khmer Animism, but also in many other societies here in Southeast Asia and beyond, of course. Just a word, because I know it was not clear for everybody. Potent places, places endowed with energy, special kind of energy, special kind of potency, special spiritual energy that I will explain in a few minutes. So first, today I would like to take Professor Descola's general model of animism as a very inspirational starting point, and go on with recent discussions of some particularities of its Southeast Asian forms. And in my third point, I will argue that there is a specific kind of non-human beings in Southeast Asia animism, and probably, of course, elsewhere in the world, that have not been considered with the full attention by the scholars working on Southeast Asia until now. And these specific beings are what I would call potent places. Potent places are particular spots in the environment that are endowed by the people living around with some kind of potency, some kind of energy, some kind of force that I will define later. Just a word first on animism. In Professor Descola's well-known work, animism has some distinctive features as compared with the analogist, totemist, and naturalist ontology of his model that has been described this morning. And of course, those features are widely found by anthropologists working throughout Southeast Asia. In its broadest definition, Professor Descola proposes that animism is humans, this is my translation from the French original version, humans' imputation to non-humans of an interiority similar to their own. This arrangement humanizes plants, and especially animals, since the souls they are endowed with allow them to establish relations of communication, both with the latter and between themselves. So if we come now to some Southeast Asian variations of animism, I would like, well, we have discussed that this morning and yesterday. I would like that some features of Professor Descola's analogist ontology are also widely present in Southeast Asia. Especially, I would say, the volatility of some elements constituting the interiority and the physicality of the beings. For example, in Cambodia and in other societies, people are supposed to have 19 souls, and they are quite volatile. They can go out, especially during the night, during the dreams. And it's very important, we discussed that already, to maintain them and to attach them to the body. And also, of course, the importance of the cults to ancestors, which is not present in Cambodia, but in many other societies here in Southeast Asia. And, of course, other features of analogist ontology are also present in Southeast Asia, like the importance of mediums, possession, and also, I would say, because I've worked on health and illness for many years, the existence of the polarized classification system in hot, cold, damp, dry, and so on. I would like now to come to the edited book published last year by Kai Erem and Guido Sprenger, who revisits the debates on animism and reflect on its Southeast Asian variation. Ethnographic works on animism in Southeast Asia are not new, of course. They are as old as anthropology itself in Southeast Asia. But what is new in this book is, for me at least, its attempt to draw a more general model that would go beyond the usual distinction between mainland and island Southeast Asia on one hand, and Austronesian and Austroasiatic societies on the other hand, which is not common in ethnographic publication, in books on anthropology in Southeast Asia. So RM, in his own contribution in this book, considers two main features as central to Southeast Asian animism, like Professor Descola told us this morning, namely the overwhelming presence of spirits of many different kinds, and the first and second, the widespread belief in a kind of a cosmic flow of life energy, an energy that Professor Descola also mentions as a characteristic of animism in general. So in RM's terms, Southeast Asian society's system of representation can be defined as, this is the definition is here, as hierarchical animism in which beings are integrated by a principle of asymmetric intersubjectivity between unequal souls and differentiated according to the formula, different degrees of spirit potency, different body. So I will not elaborate on this because I would like to speak about potent places. Now, potent places are, for me, I would describe them as neglected, animistic, non-human beings. In all the attempts to characterize animism in Southeast Asia, it's merely the relationships between human spirits and their environment, particularly animals, trees, plants, and water, that are considered together. And there is a big absent for me in this model. It's the places themselves, potent places. They have not received a particular theoretical treatment and are only considered as a kind of substratum of human and non-humans' lives and activities. And they are very often analyzed in anthropology, Southeast Asian anthropology, as simple abodes of spirits. There are some reasons about that, but it would be too long to explain, at least to give my point of view on this today. I would like just to argue here that so this is the reason for the absence of a study of potent places for me. So I will argue that many ethnographic data show that, in the contrary, potent places are built in Southeast Asia by Southeast Asian people as non-human beings per se, as such, endowed with their own interiority, their own physicality. These particular places, just as animals, plants, and some spirits, are perceived as having full agency. They can manifest their presence, they can manifest their force, for example, through the presence of termite mounds, signifying living, growing land. They can manifest themselves through some animals, especially some insects, like centipede, considered to be the assistants or the protective spirits of the place. They can interact with human and non-human beings, for example, through dreams, via which these places express their needs and their feeling to their human neighbors or visitors. They can show their feelings, they can show their wishes. For example, I have an ethnographic small example in Cambodia, where all my pictures of a potent place were blurred, and I was explained that the place did not want me to take picture of it, and so on. So those potent places can become also angry at human beings. They can bring accidents, illnesses, sometimes even fatal, for those who do not behave properly in these places, etc. My second point is that those potent places, as animistic non-human beings in Southeast Asia animism, have a specific physicality. In that all the elements belonging to the potent places are consubstantial and endowed with the same kind of energy, the same kind of potency. All the trees, the animals, the spirits, the earth, the buildings, the objects, the humans that are part of those potent places, but not just this, but also some specific events, especially violent events, and also the offerings whose provision and wealth are proportional to the potency of the place. All this is endowed with the consubstantiality, with the same substance. And all these elements are imbued with the particular energy found in potent places, and in return, all these elements contribute to its intensity. So the issue of consubstantiality is also addressed by Professor Descola in his general model of animism, when he speaks of a, I quote, community of substance of all matter, which maintains continuities between the human and non-human beings and the lower temporary physical transformation, which are things that we can see also in Southeast Asia. So just to give some flesh and flavor to these general statements, I will give briefly the example, an ethnographic example coming from Cambodia. In the place when I've been working for years now, in western Cambodia, in the province of Posat. This particular example is, of course, far from unique, and the model is widespread all over Cambodia and beyond. This is the network of potent places. And these networks of potent places is centered on the shrine of this very powerful and well-known in Cambodia land guardian spirits, which has been very recently anthropomorphized, but which was just represented as a termite mound before the Pol Pot regime. And this land guardian spirit is a former human being, but not all the land guardian spirits are human beings in Cambodia and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. But this land guardian spirit was a military chief of a 16th century Khmer king. So this military chief and his king were involved in wars against the Thai people, the Thai royal army in this area, western Cambodia, and many places around the shrine of Kliang Mueng, the name of these land guardian spirits, are said to have witnessed and retained the memory of all those military events which happened there. And they are all said to be potent in the way I have just defined. So you see, number one is the shrine of this land guardian spirit, and there are many places around which form the kind of network of potent places, all related in a kind of a geography, a mythical, historical geography with many local legends, and it's also mentioned in the royal chronicles, Khmer royal chronicles. So I will give here some example of those potent places. You see here an altar which seems to be a Buddha's altar, but in fact it's a Buddhicized place of a land guardian spirit. You see here somebody, but it's not just a land guardian spirit. The whole place is potent with the trees, the altar, the Buddhist image, and so on. You have the same place, this is the same place, but you have here a ritual of asking for rain to this potent place. This is a very potent 16th century rune tower in a Buddhist monastery, and this place is really, really. I cannot show that here, but this is the tower, a post-Angkorian tower, and it's considered as really, really potent. You can also have potent people like this monk, who is the abbot of a monastery of this network, potent objects made of wood from the pristine forest. And this is a Bodhi tree full of potency also in another monastery. And this is a very typical archetypal shrine of a land guardian spirit with no representation except a termite mound in the inside. This is another land guardian spirit's shelter with a stone as a representation of this land guardian spirit. And this is also a very potent place, which is a termite mound. So these are some examples of the variety of forms of all those potent places. So in my last point, I would just like to offer an analysis of the potency involved in Southeast Asian potent places. This is drawn from a comparative collective work performed by a group of French anthropologists that I have coordinated in Paris over the 6 or 5 last years. And the outcome of this collective work will be published this month in the Asian Pacific Journal of Anthropology in Canberra. So what is the potency of those animistic potent places made of? I would say that there are 3 elements. First, the first element is the earth itself, the land. Potent places in most Southeast Asian societies present themselves as knots or points of concentration in the flow of cosmic energy in the earth. The earth itself is central in Southeast Asian animism, and I really think that it has not been studied enough as such. And it's especially the case, I think, in mainland Southeast Asia. We all know Paul Mu's seminal work in 1933, when he speaks about the, I quote, religion of the land and of the divinization of the energies of the ground, which characterizes the whole of Southeast Asia's religious beliefs as far as its Oceanian borders, following Paul Mu's analysis. So I would argue that as an hypothesis from our Paris work groups on potent places, that this cosmic energy, this animistic cosmic energy, is more characterized by flows and flux in island Southeast Asia, whereas it's more strongly linked to the earth, to the land, to immobility in mainland Southeast Asia. So the second element of this potency of the places are spirits. They are very often associated with the potency of the places. They are, of course, a fundamental element of Southeast Asia animism, as I have said, and it's even the case in the hierarchical variation proposed by Erem in his edited book that we have mentioned this morning and that I have just mentioned now Erem and Sprenger book on Southeast Asia animism, published last year. So these spirits are often seen as the owners and the protectors of the land, from the village level to larger political realms, and Formoso have worked on that, Tannenbaum and Camera also, and other people, of course. The last element of this potency, I would argue, is the world religion's additional potency. There is a third element which has to be combined, which is combined with the two first I have mentioned in the making of the potency of the land, and somewhat subsumed in the animistic cosmic energy mentioned above. It's what could be called religious in the sense of belonging to a world religion, religious or spiritual energy associated with Buddhism in mainland Southeast Asia or with Islam in island Southeast Asia. These forces stem from the core doctrinal values of these world religions. For example, there is a very good example that I found myself on my field research, during my field research, the example of Buddhist Theravadin societies, which all use the idea of a parami, which is a Pali word, and which means originally the Bodhisattva's virtues, the core Buddhist virtues. And I would argue that this religious spiritual energy has been reinterpreted into the animistic model of energy. So now Boromei in Khmer or Parami in Thai language have an animistic flavor. And we were speaking about power this morning, but I would say that this potency, especially this bodhisized form of potency, can be transformed into political power, can be transformed into different kind of potency is a kind of a largest category in which we can analyze political power maybe. So just a few words of conclusion. I have aimed to show in this presentation that the potency attributed to some extraordinary places in Southeast Asian societies are made of various elements that cannot be reduced to the presence of spirits, but are instead built on the basis of an overall perception of what places are and on the manipulation of various elements that are fundamental in Southeast Asian animism. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you very much. Just before we take questions, I've been tasked to make a few comments regarding the four speakers, which is quite a difficult proposition. There's a lot to cover here. So what I'll try to present are just some provocations, some discussion points that I hope has some degree of resonance with what you guys have been talking about. I'm a political theorist by training, so please forgive me. A lot of the comments will be oriented in kind of in that direction. You know, we've all been kind of talking about today the ontological turn, essentially, right, in the social sciences, and I think it's important to kind of contextualize and bear in mind that this turn is perhaps symptomatic of a larger dissatisfaction in post-structuralist, or you could say critical thought from the 1980s. Dissatisfaction with the problem or the politics of representation. So I think you can see this emerging not only in anthropology, but also in science and technology studies, in my own discipline of political theory, has come to it rather late, but it's slowly trying to engage with this question of representation and some of the issues it throws up. So I have kind of four kind of ideas I'd like to throw out, and I'll try to connect them as much as possible to what everyone has been talking about. The first is, and also to Professor Descala, the first is regarding kind of the paradox or the aporia, you could call it, of attempting to go beyond naturalism while also kind of remaining somewhat faithful to the taxonomies of categorization and classification that is necessarily part of the naturalist project, right? So the kind of the optics of knowledge, or indeed kind of the ontological form that naturalism tends to kind of reproduce. And I think that question is a really old one. It goes way back to debates between rationalists, empiricists. You can see this in debates back in kind of in Plato even, right? So I think it's important to keep in mind that these problems are really deeply rooted, and extend beyond kind of the Enlightenment and kind of the techno-scientific revolution, right, in the Western world. I think they're deeper philosophical problems that some of the questions that Professor Descala raises are trying to tackle, right? That's why it's so profound and monumental in my opinion. So in terms of this kind of paradox of going beyond naturalism by using naturalism, it begs the question, to what extent can we really deconstruct the great divide between nature and culture? And perhaps kind of the other kind of embodiments and dichotomies that this generates, right? There's some people have mentioned the distinction, the dichotomy between the discursive and the material, obviously humans and non-humans, but also between organic and inorganic forms of matter. I mean, these are all bound up in this larger dualism. So the question, right, is how can we go beyond naturalism how can we sufficiently transcend it? What would the criteria be? How could we then come to the point where we say, okay, bingo, we've done it. In other words, how can we overcome or avoid reproducing this dualism if we employ those methodologies, right? I think that's one of the kind of a foundational question we've talked about today. And the point in particular that I'd like to raise, and maybe throw out there, is what kind of critical purchase politically is lost, right, when we lose the distinction between sapience, right, what it means to be human, however you define that, right, however you draw that line, and sentience, right, other forms of life. I think that that's bound up in all of these kind of discussions to one extent or another. A lot of post-humanist thought, right, in recent decades has started to try to grapple with this, but there tends to be, and I'm rather critical of these variants, there tends to be an element of this literature that collapses the distinction between, or puts material agency, right, agency of non-humans on the same continuum as human agency, okay, or a political agency, right, an agency that has kind of a telos, or understanding of history and purpose, or a conception of the future per se, right? However we might want to think about that. So that would be the first set of problems I would like to kind of present or try to suggest about thinking, how can we think about naturalism by using the methodology of naturalism. The second question is kind of more methodological, and this is kind of to throw it out there, is regarding translation, right? The question of translation, particularly in respect to concepts, vernacular or otherwise, and the problem this poses for the researcher methodologically. So I'm thinking here of one person who's tackled this, in my estimation, is Eduardo Kohn, right? His work in the Venezuelan Amazon. I think you're
Ecuadorian Amazon.
Ecuadorian, sorry. sorry. I'm not a geography student. He's utilizing the work of the semitician Charles Sanders Peirce, and has really tried to kind of take seriously this question of translation as intrinsic to an investigation of non-human agency. And I think it's if you haven't read it, it's quite interesting, particularly for someone from a political science background. So I think he raises important questions regarding the status of communication, and in particular symbolic thought that I think needs to be addressed when we try to think of such things as potency, right, and translating objects into concepts, right? And it's this kind of distinction that I would like to kind of pose. It's this distinction. What happens when we lose this distinction? What is actually lost? What kind of critical purchase goes away? Some of us have talked about how kind of this distinction is confined within kind of a Descartesian cogito that places it in kind of that separates or places this relationship between humans and non-humans as kind of a fine distinction. And others have raised the point that one way in which we can start to go about this is to use other kind of technical terminology such as milieu, which decenters kind of the Descartesian subject. So I think that is quite a productive avenue, and I would like to kind of hear more about how we can kind of go about that methodologically speaking, right, in our research. Okay, I've been blabbering. One last point. I'd like to emphasize, I like the emphasis that was made regarding kind of overlapping modes of identification. And I'd like to kind of throw out the question of the extent in which we can kind of think about how the vernacular can be said, like kind of the kind of anargalism kind of vernacular forms can be said to overlap with naturalism, right? How can we kind of locate that criteria? How can we think through that process of hybridity? So I think I'll leave it there. I would like to throw one thought that came to me when Philip, also as well, when you, Christian, were talking about that project of resilience, the Santoyama project, was it? I'd like to throw out the idea that perhaps, how can we, I think, Philip, you talked about, how can we start to think about how these kind of ontological schemas potentially reach a tipping point in which they no longer are defined by one particular aspect rather than another. I'm not really articulating this very clearly, but it seems to me potentially that we could be reaching a point in terms of modern technoscience in which the old kind of Newtonian schemas of science, which are based on a kind of a linear, mechanistic form of science, are being superseded by complexity science since the 1970s. And this is bound up with the sustainable development discourse, right? So I found that interesting because it kind of, it would provide an interesting counterpoint to looking at kind of hybridity and anargalism within the context of development per se. So I'll leave it at that and maybe open it up to some other people for questions as well. Thank you.
But I would like to thank Christian Culas and Anne Guillou first for their very interesting material, which is food for thought for me. I won't comment on it, I'll try to digest it. I would like to return to some of the comments you made. The first one is on the very complex and vexing question of how can you produce the non-naturalist interpretation within a naturalist framework, which is of course an extremely difficult question to answer. My own take on that is I am adopting a structuralist point of view, which means that the four modes of identification are a structural ontological group of transformation. And this means that none of the modes have a higher value, let's say, than any of the others. Each of them is a transformation of the others. So this is a basic thing in the sense that I do not adopt the position of Sirius, a sort of imperial gaze on ethnographic material, but I surmise that each of the modes of identification precisely is a transformation of another, meaning that politically there is no one that is dominating. And this leads to the second comment you made. Eduardo Cohn's book is an extremely interesting one. I really suggest those of you who do not know it to read it. I wrote the French foreword of the foreword for the French edition of the book. And there was a large discussion in How, which is an online journal of anthropology, to which a number of people participated, including me. One of the limitations, I think, of Cohn's book is what he is trying to propound is a biosemiosis, that is, semiology of living beings, which excludes places, potent places, which excludes non-biological entities. And I think it's a limitation because, in fact, in some cases, to return to the political program, Professor Chayan this morning mentioned Marisol de la Cadena's book on the Andes. And one of the interesting aspects now, with what is happening in the Andes, in the movements against mining by multinational companies, is that the protests are organized by local people, indigenous people in most cases, around the idea, of course, that they have to protect their land, they have to protect their land from pollution, etc., but also that places and non-biological entities such as lakes, rivers, mountains, springs, etc., are part of a collective. And so they have to act as members of the collective because they can demonstrate on the main square of Cusco and the mountain cannot. And they speak of, in fact, they're the voice persons of the mountain, which is a non-biological entity, because the mountain is part of the collective, no? So we see very interesting ways now of political mobilization, and I understand that there are some cases like that with mining also in Southeast Asia, where in fact pre-modern or pre-naturalist forms of political mobilization are extremely efficient in gaining something against naturalist, capitalist voracity. That's just a comment.
Can I just respond? That's an interesting example, and it reminded me of social movements against dam development in northern Kachin, particularly around the Mitsun Dam, drawing off kind of old traditional animist beliefs. My kind of return question would be those forms of those forms of mobilization revolve around, it seems to be, the generation of a public controversy in which people then can mobilize. And that's a different type of order question, it seems, to then affording or ascribing agency to the mountain as kind of a political agent. Do you find in that instance people speaking in those terms in regards to the mountain or in terms of other kind of biospherical objects?
It's not political agency in the sense that the mountain would have a specific agency. That is why I was interested by your presentation in particular. These potent places are not individualities in the Andes, for instance. And I think that in some analogical or analogous cases, they are not individualities. They are part of a collective, including humans and non-humans. And as such, humans have to defend or protect or act on the behalf of these places, entities, whatever. Otherwise, the harmony or the balance between the elements of the collective would be disturbed. And there would be serious consequences. In the case of a mountain, there would be landslides and et cetera, et cetera. So it's not so much a question of agency as using, as a political agent, an element of the collective, and as a political agent, as I said this morning, not in a relation of power, but in a relation between worlds, no? That is, using the mountain as an agent against a mining company, for instance, no?
Yes, please.
Can I just add something to that? Alf Holmberg has recently, or is producing shortly, a book on the issue precisely of mining among in a North American Indian community, Mi'kmaq. And he shows very well that precisely the Mi'kmaq discourse about the mountain quite clearly, it makes it quite clear that they are not attributing intentionality and political agency, in a sense, to the mountain, but that the mountain precisely is a vital part of a collecting, in a sense, is what the French philosopher Simondon called a being of solicitude. In other words, a being that needs to be the object of solicitous attention, caretaking, and so on and so forth, because he plays a vital role in the some sort of network forming an Umwelt. So such beings can have a high political relevance without actually being political agents in the normal sort of individualistic, classical sense of being political agents, or even economic agents for that matter.
Yes, please, in the back there.
I have just a couple of things to add to this conversation. So when you asked the question, Robert, as a moderator, what is lost by ascribing agency to these cases, if you will, I would suggest that what is lost is our self-proclaimed right to take them down and use them for our own purposes. Now, let me have a couple of things, and so that is what is lost when we attribute agency to something like a mountain. We lose the right to exploit it freely. So that's one thing. And the other thing, in terms of agency, I actually have a little vignette that I've published on a couple times. And in terms of potent places here in Southeast Asia, and especially the way that they get attached to spirits, they do act. They do act actually as agents. And there's one story in which the company was there taking down the forest in front of the mountain where the temple was, and not a spirit medium, a woman, was spontaneously possessed by the spirit, which anyone in Southeast Asia knows is rather rare. And the spirit confronted the people on the bulldozers, forced them to get down, and stopped the activity of the company at that particular juncture in time. So there is a slippery zone there about agency and community. But the community is the key part, right? And so the idea, the interpretation of the people that were around is that the mountain, this is a reciprocal communitas. And the mountain was protecting them, as well as they would protect the mountain by gathering in the central square, right? Because the mountain can't get to the square. So we go to the square. And we can't stop the bulldozers, but the mountain can. So there is a back and forth that I think also comes out in your work, Professor, of this eating and being eaten and sharing of the space. And I bet that Anne might have some stories on that too with the photographs. Thanks.
Any further questions?
We're all exhausted with this thing.
Perhaps, perhaps we can carry on afterwards, informally, if anyone has any pressing questions afterwards.
Well, I have a question, a more general question of these workshops about the potent places, maybe, which are indeed very important in Southeast Asia, everywhere. Also really embed in the socio-political organization of the Indo-Buddhist kingdoms. And I was wondering how far we can think these potent places as animist or analogist. And I think, well, it's an important question. Why it is more animist than analogist? Why did you choose not to categorize these potent places in an analogist ontology? What criteria was dominant for you to choose analogism, animism?
No, for me they are clearly animistic more than analogists because they have all the characteristic, you know, in terms of interiority and physicality. They are, I think, for me the core definition of animism is more relevant here, clearly. Even the concepts, the question of we discussed about that, the question of continuity of the continuity of matter, you know, in a way you can. The question of consubstantiality also, which is really important for me in potent places. This is a kind of hybrid being. I think it's a kind of a hybrid animistic being. In so far as all the elements are part of this. But for me, the place is more. I use the word place in a more phenomenological sense. It's not just one mountain or one water spring. It's a real place in the sense that it's a place where human beings live, or human beings are, or deities are, and which is at the same time subject of study and at the same time object of study. It's the reason why it's so difficult. Maybe it's the reason why it has been so absent from there is almost no work on potent places in Southeast Asia. Very dispersed things. You can find many different small things in many publications, but there is no research on potent places as such. What is a place, and what is potency involved in those places? But I don't see so much analogist elements in those places. So even not just in Cambodia, but we had this comparative approach, and I would say that they have the same. I don't know what we can discuss about that, but for me it's clearly an animistic model.
Yes, lady over there.
Just a follow-up question on that issue, if I may. You mentioned at the outset of your talk that these potent places were often linked to violence.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that? Because that might offer a clue to the question you raised. Why consider this more as animism than an instance of analogy?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. So there is a kind of. It's not just in it. Somebody mentioned Timor-Leste. You know, it has been studied in Timor-Leste by Judith Boven-Zippen also. This is the kind of idea that the earth or this land is able to suck, to absorb, you know, past events. and the events in this case is materialized in an animistic way. It's, there is a material aspect of the past, there is a material aspect of events. So violent death create a kind of a special energy. Special energy that can be controlled or not controlled. Well, I began, of course, to work on that because I worked on this memory of the Khmer Rouge regime, and when I began to study the memory of the Khmer Rouge regime and all the places that has been violent death, and especially mass graves, that I began to think that there was something about those places. Or also mass graves of the Khmer Rouge regime are most of the time also potent places. But you're right. What is at stake in the case of violent death? What emanates from those violent death? Maybe it's more an analogist element. You're right. But you know, for me, I would interpret that at least as the energy created by a life which has not been lived. This is a kind of a potential life that has not been lived, and this creates energy, at least in Buddhist society, I think, Buddhist societies.
I don't know if what I talk is connecting what you say, but in the Sino-Vietnamese system, there was the Feng Shui or Feng Shui, and there is a special identity. For example, some mountain, we have the line of the dragon, and there is, for example, the dragon male and the phoenix female, and there was a conception and a representation almost physically. It's been this kind of potent place. We can see them in the place, and there was a description, there was a book about that. It means it's very formal. It's not only one place with power. I think we know where is this place, where is the head of the dragon, where is the queue of the dragon, where is the liver of the dragon, and it means it's very, very formal in the Chinese system. Because what you say, it means, I don't know if for the local people they have an idea of all the connection, the system.
That's a
for
concentration.
Them. Concentration.
So the borders are blurred.
Okay.
Yeah.
That is, yes. I don't know if you make a comparison between, because one is very formal and I don't know, just to open the discussion.
Could I just make a kind of quick comment in response to the lady earlier who made the comment about what is lost? Yeah. Oh, hi, Courtney. Okay. So in kind of how should I say, in proposing or kind of putting forth that question, I was trying to complicate, right, the tendency I find in a lot of particularly post-humanist thought to do away with kind of a very critical distinction of modernity between subjects and objects, right, making this demarcation, right, because it seems that with that injunction, right, you have at a certain level the basis for a lot of naturalist philosophy, right, or for naturalism to a certain extent. So if we lose the right to claim a mountain, right, we also lose the right to protect the mountain potentially. So it's part of this kind of, I think, a larger paradox within liberal modernity, right, or modern technoscience, right, that it's brought us climate catastrophe, but it's also providing we're trying to provide the solution. Right, so we're bound up with this as much as we want to try to escape it. So the tradition of rights, right, it goes back to naturalism in and of itself, goes back to the natural law tradition, and goes back to kind of notions that human beings, if we want to make any sort of dividing line, right, as Homo sapiens or whatever, as a species, is our ability to plan for the future, have a telos and a kind of understanding for history, right? And it's that distinction that I'm wary of giving up in its entirety. I do agree with you in terms of kind of the ravages that kind of modern science and this mastery over nature and Baconian technoscience has brought, but it has also brought a lot of kind of, how should I say, less detrimental impacts as well.
I think that if you want to get out of possessive individualism, you have to get out of also this general framework. And of course, it's very scary in many respects. But at the same time, it's a huge challenge for us in this century to try to imagine new forms of collectives that have no bearing is what we were used to previously, in order to accommodate a vast number of non-humans, including here in our post-industrial societies, which our legal tools in particular and political tools do not allow us to do. So, and in that respect, what animists or analogists or whatever the name you wish to give them, people are doing is a remarkable stimulation for us to try to imagine new forms of association which have not been previously experimented in the West.
The gentleman over there.
I think this discussion is very interesting, and but the question is, but with potent places, it's better to ask why are these places potent? And potent places are potent because people experience potency. They experience this force, the interiority with interiority or the potency. And this then brings us straight to that anthropology of consciousness and body conscious and experience and body conscious. And then that again then brings us more into realms of the shamanic and the experiences as well, which I think has been written about. Yeah. And once we enter the realm of the body conscious, we enter the realm of ethics and psychology, which brings in the psychological body or the indigenous form of what it means to be a body that is not just the interiority of souls and spirits, traditionally called soul and spirit, but the emotions as well, how elements from that potent place enters through my interiority, through the soul, whatever, and it enters my very being, which then is that it emerges in my emotions, my feelings, and so that has to be also brought into this model of the potent state. And then that then brings in shamanism, which then comes to heal, to separate elements of interiority, aspects where interiority have emerged, but it could be an animal interiority or potent place interiority. So shamanism thus becomes very central as the healing technique of keeping apart what has merged. You see what I mean?
Right, in a sense, all those places I label them as potent places because people have experienced them as potent places, and they told me that there were, of course, yeah, you're right. So I come back a little bit to Abigail. They have the same interiority as other beings. So. But the question of physicality is a bit problematic. It's a kind of hybrid physicality. Yeah. But possession. There is no shamanism in Cambodia, but possession and mediumship. It's not the only way to interact with those potent places. They just can bring you illness. They can just show that they are not happy and are angry, but it's not that. It's really one of my purpose today, just to show that they are not simple abodes of spirits. There are other things. They are hybrid. They have a hybrid physicality. Not all those places are abodes of spirit, and they don't always interact with human beings through possessions. It's often the case, but not always.
What you were showing was that it's actually interesting. It's the same thing like in Thailand. I myself work in Indonesia, so I
know you work.
Yeah. What you were saying was that these potent places were actually contained by Buddhism, basically, and maybe have been generated by Buddhism. And this is something somebody said something about analogism, that maybe it's more influenced by analogism. In the context that I was working in, which I would say is animism, although they're Malay style animism, or asli animism, the places are not actually, as you mentioned earlier, they kind of spark, they kind of like, there's no boundaries. And so they influence people. And they influence people through dreams. They influence people through altered states, what in another discourse is called altered states of consciousness. And this then becomes very, very important to keep the boundaries. Boundary making is very, very important, but through magic, through forms of magic and through symbolism, to keep those boundaries of the body in order to keep those influences from penetrating. And this is another issue with regards to some of the ontology literature, especially Vira's de Castro work, where you find people metamorphosing into other beings, and it's described like it's a kind of a religious experience, but it isn't. It's dangerous. I mean, in many ways, it is dangerous. It's dangerous for me to engage in a romantic experience with another animal, become that animal. It's dangerous for me in here. It's dangerous for people. So this is really, and for this reason, shamans have to separate. And techniques are used to separate these potencies.
Yeah, I would like to add something about boundaries, which is very important. For me, a potent place is the exact contrary to a sacred place. Because a sacred place, if we were speaking about definition of what Durkheim at least considered as a sacred place, it is the separation of lay place to a sacred one. The very process of the separation creates a sacredness. But in the case of potency, it's a concentration, that there is no boundary, like in the case of in the Sino Vietnamese world. There is no boundary. There is a concentration point, and then the potency is less and less manifest itself less and less. So the question of boundaries and of borders is different. It could take the form of a mandala when the potent places are Indo-Buddhist or related to the monarchy, or related to, especially to the monarchy. If the political center, some potent places are political center, but not in all cases.
Last question.
Last question. I love that, right? The potent place is the exact opposite of the sacred place. But don't you think that a lot of the sacred places are grabbed potent places? Isn't that part? I've just done some work on the Sima boundaries, right? And not in modern times, but around the Buddhist temples. But we see in ancient places, we see these boundaries were put up, these boundary markers around what were obviously sacred places, around places of cave paintings in northern Thailand, and in this place that I'm talking about on the mountain on Phnom Penh. And so there's a little right? It's not bounded, and what I think is that it doesn't bind very well, right? And the making of the boundary is slippery. But what do you think?
No, I would say that some Buddhist places and many Buddhist monasteries are potent places, but it's not the same. I mean, the how do you call that in English? The what we saw in the monastery, sacred.
Sacred boundary.
the bones, the markers, the markers of the sacred place. It's not that who make a potent place. This is some Buddhist place can be potent places, but not all potent places are Buddhist places. So they can be sacred in the sense that they are built by Buddhism, also built by Buddhism, but it's not always the case because we are in an animistic system, and I think I would follow John Holt, you know, in a society like the Cambodian society, and I understand it's also the case in Laos and Thailand. Animism help to understand how Buddhism is practiced, not the contrary. So.
Okay, I think we're all quite exhausted. Please join me in thanking Christian and Anne, and give yourself a round of applause for sticking out for this long.